Welcome back to the Happy Cynics, everybody. This is Isaac, the all-seeing eye, and with me is DJ Dr. K.
Yo.
We are back to continue talking about the effects of narcissistic Christianity, which is a term that we've sort of been discussing over the last week, and that we've sort of coined. I'm sure other people have talked about it, but it's this idea that like God acts specifically on your behalf. And last week we looked at some of the causes of that, some of the motivations, some of the things that drive that sort of mindset. This week we're going to be looking at what are the effects, what happens when people believe that, what are the implications of that style of belief.
Right. So why don't we just dive right into talking about the prosperity gospel?
Yeah. I mean, I think I mentioned last week that like this becomes, I think, really problematic when the people who are winners in society, who are the ones who generally adopt this mindset, what happens when they start teaching this mindset to people who are not the winners? And I think the prosperity gospel is kind of what you get out of that. You give us money, you'll get money. You're faithful to God, God will bless you.
All right. So let me ask you this. All right, we'll get a little specific here. Would you consider Joel Osteen to be one of the prosperity gospel people? Or would you limit that to, say, people like Kenneth Copeland, Rod Parsley? I don't know if you know.
I think they're all part of it, aren't they? I don't know them that well. I know Kenneth Copeland just because he's so crazy looking. But
it's kind of like if Dick York, the original Darren on Bewitched, if his head were if his head were on the verge of exploding.
Yeah. No, and I mean, I would think I would include Joel Osteen in there. I don't know anything about Joel Osteen though, other than he writes a lot of books and he has a lot of money.
Well, you know, Joel Osteen, I don't think has the thing where if you send in money, God's going to make sure you have plenty and reward you and you'll get like, sevenfold back or something like that. But
no, but he does have if you are faithful, God will bless you.
Yeah. It's like,
and if you want to be successful, be a Christian.
God's got all these great plans for you. And it's like, it's all going to fall into place. So it may not be financial prosperity, but I think it would not be unfair to characterize it as a type of prosperity.
Well, and I mean, I think that the prosperity gospel, prosperity gospel is sort of like a dirty word, right? Like,
right.
Nobody wants to be labeled as like a prosperity gospel teacher or whatever.
And why do you think that is?
Right, because it's a false. It's always been treated like a false gospel. It's always been heresy to say that like God will bless you if you do this, this, and this, because it's manipulating God. Has that
always been the case? Or was that not one of the Reformation critiques of the Catholic Church?
Well, no, you make a good point that it is sort of a Reformation critique of the Catholic Church because the purchasing of indulgences.
Yeah, and the benefices. Giving the priest like their own land and all that. Okay, so
but nowadays it's sort of it's a dirty word.
It
right?
is.
I mean, it's sort of like fundamentalist is a dirty word.
So okay, so here's a cynical question for you. Do you think that it's a dirty word because people are really opposed to it, or like in principle? Or because people don't like people just overtly admitting that that's what they're about?
I think it's the second one. I think it's the overt, like, this is what we're about. We're about being successful and God will give you success if you're faithful. I think people don't like that because people know that not everybody is successful.
Yeah.
However, I think in principle, the prosperity gospel operates in a lot of churches in more subtle ways.
Well, and that's the thing. I mean, I could see where people like in some small struggling church with only a handful of people would really, really believe that, those that are well off, they are really not true followers of Christ, et cetera, et cetera. They don't know what it's like. They're not living sacrificially. They're too worldly. I heard all this stuff in my home church growing up.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But it's very difficult for me to think that these large suburban churches, even they want to say, oh, we're not about prosperity gospel. But
Right.
and then like they're saying that while they're sitting in a multi-million-dollar facility.
Exactly. And I've literally firsthand seen that so many times.
Well, I've been in commencement services where you're sitting in a multi-million-dollar facility and they're still reading the scripture, lay not up for yourselves treasure on earth where moth and rust does corrupt. And I'm like, how can you get up and read this stuff with a straight face? It's like, oh my goodness. It just boggles my mind. But, at least
I've literally heard pastors brag about how much money their church has in the bank.
Oh, yeah, I don't doubt it. There was an old anecdote. I don't know if it's true or not, but I forget which of the early popes it was this was supposed to be, who was it? It wasn't Polycarp. It was, anyway, but it was some other, like elder in the church, but supposedly, the Pope said, well, the church can no longer say silver and gold have I none, because that's what Peter and John said to at the beggar at the beautiful gate. Silver and gold have we none, but what we have we give to you. Rise up and walk in the name of Jesus. Well, supposedly the Pope said, no longer can the church say silver and gold have I none. And then supposedly the saint's response was, yeah, but neither can the church say rise up and walk.
Right. Yeah.
So I don't know. But it does seem to me that, so are we lumping too much into but this is part of that narcissism thing. So it's like, I don't want to be one of these, because you even hear people criticize, Judas, he was saying, we could have given this money to the poor instead of wasting it on, whenever, was it Mary Magdalene, anoints his feet with oil, and, wipes his feet with her hair. So even Jesus got the spa treatment once in a while,
Yeah.
Jesus,
you'd think it would make it a little hard to walk.
Can you get that ingrown toenail there while you're down there?
Oh, gross.
Well, anyway.
I've never enjoyed thinking about Jesus' feet, but now I really don't enjoy it.
Well, Jesus washed the disciples' feet. I mean, jeez.
It's still gross.
It is. Well, the Anabaptist people will still do that. They'll have like a foot washing before.
My youth group did it.
Really?
Yeah, and it was gross.
It wasn't like this great.
I didn't have a spiritual moment.
Oh, you
engaging
didn't?
with that.
Okay.
No.
Okay. I hear people say, "Oh, yeah, it's such a great bonding experience," or whatever.
No.
Yeah, I don't know.
Don't need it.
I don't need to bond over a toe jam. Anyway,
have you ever seen Pulp Fiction?
Yes.
The opening scene where they're talking about giving Marcellus Wallace's wife a foot rub.
Yeah.
For those of you who have seen that movie, you'll know what we're talking about.
Yeah. Well, so maybe prosperity gospel, if we're going to say that, is that kind of a sliding scale thing, like different degrees?
Well, I think you have to think about it. At least this is how I am approaching it. I think if you think about it structurally, what prosperity gospel is saying is that if you are faithful, maybe in a very specific way, God will bless you in a specific way. And I mean, one of the most egregious examples I've seen of this personally is when the church talks about mental health. That if you pray, if you go to Bible study, if you are faithful, then your mental health problems will go away. And there's whole like groups of Christianity that are dedicated to this idea that mental illness is not a real illness. It's in a separate category and you can pray it away.
Right.
That is prosperity gospel.
Mm-hmm.
Like flat out, like it's not money, but it is well, if you just do this, this, and this, if you're devoted, if you spend your time in the church, then you'll be blessed in some way that's miraculous.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean,
if you have enough faith, you can tell this mountain to move and it'll be moved.
Yeah. And a lot of this comes from like some pretty shady places, I think, in like the Christian right, specifically with individuals who are tied to like Liberty University, which I know people that have graduated from Liberty University that are like, okay, people, they're good people, but the university as a whole, I mean, I think we're on the same page. Not a good thing, not a good place. Stands for the wrong thing in Christianity. And particularly the organization that's tied to this is the American Association of Christian Counselors. I mean, their whole deal is that God fixes mental problems that like counselors and psychiatrists treat. They even have their own separate accreditation because they know that their belief system, their dogma regarding this isn't real, isn't backed by scientific studies, and the field of psychology would condemn them for it. So they have their own schools, they have their own like accreditation boards, none of which are like based on anything other than this like religious doctrine. There's no science happening here, and it hurts people when that sort of thing gets replaced with faith.
Right. Did I ever tell you about my my experience doing my clinical internship in seminary?
No.
Okay, so in seminary we had to do we had to have one semester where you were in a parish setting and you were working under somebody's supervision, all that. And then you had to have one semester where you were in a clinical setting, like chaplaincy, that sort of thing. And so I did mine over one of the summers at the VA hospital in Lexington. The chaplain was overseeing about a dozen students of us. And the chaplain, after he got to know each of us, basically assigned us particular patients to visit based on experiences he felt would kind of stretch us and help us to grow. One of the people that I was assigned to visit was a guy named Sam. I don't remember his last name, but this guy, okay, so this was around, it was probably like the summer of 1992. This guy had, was getting sick and went in to get checked, and they figure he had cancer. So this is back in the day before they had like a lot of the imaging and stuff like that developed. And so they used to do what was called exploratory surgery. I don't know if you ever heard that term or not.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So before they could, do all the CAT scans and all that other stuff, before they had that technology, they used to just sometimes have to cut people open and see what they could see inside. They opened this guy up and his whole abdomen was full of cancer. And it was so advanced that they basically said, it is too far. We're not going to be able to stop it. And they gave him 4 to 6 weeks to live. Okay. So I was assigned to go in and visit this guy every week when I was there. And the chaplain was also visiting this guy. But that wasn't the difficult part. The difficult part was that Sam came from one of these faith healing churches that taught that if you have enough faith, God will heal you. And if you are sick, if there is something wrong with you and God's not healing you, it must be because you have some secret sin that you haven't dealt with or haven't confessed.
Right.
And so my assignment was to kind of tag team with the chaplain and convince this guy that he wasn't going to burn in hell because he was dying of cancer. That was difficult. I would say I was probably about your age. I was like 27 years old. And it was, it was tough when you have somebody that buys into this kind of mentality. A lot of people don't stop and think about this kind of peripheral damage that ends up happening to the people that fall outside of the norm, whatever it is.
Right. Well, I mean, I think it's sort of the same thing as like what we do with poverty, right?
Right.
As long as we don't see the poverty, we don't have to think about how our economic prosperity is built on the backs of other people's suffering. And it's the same thing with like health and mental health issues in this sort of like Christian narcissism, that like, as long as you don't have to see the people dying with cancer, as long as they're contained and away from you, you don't have to confront that your belief system implies some pretty disgusting things.
Well, this is where like even a prosperity gospel kind of mentality in this respect is very much akin to, say, something like Calvinism or like theological determinism.
Right.
Because they both commit what's called the no true Scotsman fallacy.
Fallacy, yeah. Uh-huh.
You know, so it's like, well, so like Jonathan Edwards after the Great Awakening, and then all these people backslid after their conversion experiences. And John Wesley says, well, yeah, this just goes to prove that people can lose their salvation. And Edwards, oh, no.
They were never true Christians.
That's right. They never had a real conversion. See? And so
it was
like,
all fake.
Right. In Calvinism, all the elect persevere. Well, then here's so-and-so lived a Christian life for 50 years and then left the faith and then died 6 months later. Well, then they weren't one of the elect. So it just becomes this self-authenticating thing. So it's like, okay, prosperity. If you have enough faith, God will heal you. And then if you're not the one healed, well, I guess you didn't have enough faith or you had some kind of sin or whatever. And it's just a way of, it's like a self-authentication.
Yeah. Whether God acts or not, the overarching structure of the belief is never questioned.
Right.
Regardless of the output.
Well, or even what is the basis of the belief? Other than, I mean, truthfully, I mean, I don't think like any of these people that buy into this prosperity stuff, it's not like they've conducted experiments or taken statistics. It's like,
they have actually.
Oh, come on. Really?
Yeah, for real, they have actually.
Do you think those are really honest assessments of data?
So
do they think that people that like have good faith really do better in life or something?
Well, so here's the kicker. They have done the study. They
Right.
did legitimate science. And this was like, so the studies that I've seen were both funded from like these sort of like faith healing groups and also like genuine, like journals and stuff like that.
Okay.
They were like partner projects. And they found that there is no evidence at all whatsoever for any divine intervention.
Okay. Well, I thought you were going to tell me that there was evidence to back it up.
No, they've always, it's sort of like the flat earther stuff. Like, you know, did you hear about the flat earthers who did the experiment where like they had two holes through a sheet, like a cardboard, like with a hole cut in it, and they were going to shine a flashlight through one hole of the cardboard sheet. And if the earth is flat, you can hold those two cardboard sheets at the same altitude and you should be able to see the light through the hole in the cardboard sheet. But if the earth is round, then you will need to lift one of the like holes up to be able to see the light in the other one. And they found that you have to hold the light higher to see it through the hole in the cardboard because the earth is round, right? But flat earthers were the ones doing these experiments.
So they're trying to corroborate their view.
And they disprove it. Now they never, ever give up the view. Yeah. These people are still out there doing experiments. I forget the name of the group. Man, I'm going to have a lot to cite in the references for this episode.
Well, what I was trying to say was these beliefs are not based on like established data that, oh, well, there's already all this data that shows that people that have faith recover from cancer more than people that don't. They're just.
No, the study that like was really groundbreaking was 800 people per group with 3 groups. One group was getting prayed for. One group wasn't getting prayed for.
Yes.
And the third group was getting prayed for, but they didn't know that they were getting prayed for.
I think maybe it's the same thing. I thought there were actually like 4 groups. So, they had half of them were being prayed for and half of them were not being prayed for. And then they took each of those groups and then told half of them that we have people praying for you.
Yes,
and
you're right.
And we don't have people praying for you.
Right. And what they found was that people who thought they were being prayed for actually had worse outcomes than people who thought they were not being prayed for.
Right, because they expected that the assurance of knowing somebody's praying for you would help somebody have a better mental attitude and might help their recovery.
Right.
Yeah, I remember reading.
But they found the opposite, that prayer actually hurts your outcomes because those people feel their suggested explanation is that the amount of pressure that it puts on patients to recover, actually that energy going to stress makes it harder to recover.
Well, I also think too, because I remember discussing this. Maybe I discussed this in my first book, or mentioned it, but because
what's that book called?
The Maturity of Belief.
The Maturity of Belief. You can find it on Amazon.
No, thank you. I wasn't intending a plug, but I'll take it.
Why not?
Yeah. But another possibility is that most people will not like pray over every trivial thing. Like what I mean, I don't mean they won't pray over it, but like they're not going to mention it or ask somebody to pray for them. Like, oh, would you pray? Like people are typically not going to say, hey, Isaac, would you pray for me? I've got a bad head cold. Now, if I said, Isaac, I just been diagnosed as having hepatitis. Would you pray for me? Well, something ends up being more serious.
Right.
And so one of the things that I can't remember if I just thought this myself or if I read it, but one of the possibilities was that when people were told we asked people to pray for you, that may have triggered them thinking, oh, gee, maybe
it's worse than
I think it is. Yes. And so they're asking people to pray for me.
Interesting.
So anyway, I don't know. But
and what's interesting is that part of that study was with people with terminal illness.
Yes.
And across each group, there were certain people who had like miraculous healings of a terminal illness.
Right.
And ended up living much longer than they were supposed to and having the disease cured. So whether or not you can't disprove that like, well, maybe God chose those people and the prayer just doesn't matter, but it does show that prayer doesn't seem to be the effectual cause in those miraculous healings.
Yeah. Well, and there's also the people that argue from the theological side and say, well, the reason this don't work is because you can't tempt God. God's not going to give in to some empirical test. So
right.
God knew that they were asking those people to pray. So God wasn't going to do anything, so it's like, now it's like, you're
right,
not.
Because we're not going to, this is a question of science versus faith. There is no way to bridge that gap. You cannot, through an empirical test, prove or disprove God.
No.
But you can show that prayer makes no difference.
Well, and this is, This is the effect. And I know we're talking about effects, but it just made me think about something that we didn't discuss in the previous episode. Why would somebody want to attribute their success to God instead of just saying, I've been very fortunate or, okay. So,
is it a way of like appearing moral, like taking a moral high ground? Like, well, I didn't do anything to earn this. This was all just a gift.
Well,
I'm just really grateful.
Yeah. Did I ever tell you about that? Like whenever the years I was a pastor and then there was a few people, like we would always have somebody sing like a special musical number before the message. Did I tell you about this before?
Yeah, but you can mention it again.
Yeah. So like there was one or two people that if I tell them, oh, that was a great song, you know, it really blessed us, Reverend, they say, oh, it's not me, it's God. You know, it's like,
Right.
I want to
Yeah.
say, well, didn't you practice? Or, you know,
Right. It's Tim
Did you-
Tebow again.
you just like go into a trance, "Ah," you know, and start singing.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, it does sound noble to give God the credit for everything. It's like, well, hey, you aced your test. Oh, it wasn't me, it was God. Well, it doesn't stop. Again, the person's not stopping to think about, okay, there were other people that had good intentions, good faith and all that, and they didn't do well. So where does that leave your theology? And this is where, again, this is, I think one of the effects of this kind of a mindset is it starts to make people oblivious to the pain and suffering of others because they're so focused on everything that happens to them being such a special thing. It's like, I remember in Bill Maher's movie Religulous. Have you seen that one?
I have not seen it.
Oh, you need to watch that. I keep telling you that, right?
Yeah.
Well,
I'll get around to it one of these days.
I think I've told you about this illustration where he's interviewing, one of the people he's interviewing is a guy named Steve Burke, who's part of Jews for Jesus. And so Bill Maher wants to know why he became a Christian. Okay. And he's like, well, God proved to me he was real. He did all these miracles and stuff. And then he tells the story, about he's sticking, hand out and it started to rain into the cup. The guy says, if you want a drink of water, stick your hand out and pray for rain, and started pouring rain. And
right.
Well, anyway, he's like, I live a life of miracles. Like, I know that maybe that makes people feel good to think that way, but do they not stop and think that everybody's life isn't good enough to get up and say, oh, I live a life of miracles. It's like the person dragging around an oxygen tank and, or riding in a wheelchair or whatever. It's like, yeah, I live a life of miracles every day. It just doesn't always work out that way. And again, you read the Gospels, and the people that Jesus is going to are not like all the successful people say, oh, thank you, Jesus, because everything's, we got money in the bank and we got plenty to eat. And then he's going to these people that were abandoned by everybody else, and who, like the one guy, didn't even have anybody to lift him, to put him into the water when the waters were troubled. And Jesus is like, okay, take up your bed and walk, and heals him. But basically, Jesus is empowering this guy to be able to do something for himself. But this is what ends up getting, I won't say it's lost altogether, but I don't think it gets the attention it probably deserves. Because when we're so focused on how wonderful our lives are and how blessed we are, that's that much less time we're not thinking about what we can do to help somebody else.
Yeah, I mean, I can give a pretty personal illustration. So, a few months ago, you remember we had a big storm come through Chicago.
Right.
We had tornadoes at O'Hare. We had tornadoes at Midway. Well, in the town that I live in, during that storm, our town had the only fatality caused by that storm.
Oh, okay.
It was a lady alone in her house. Tree fell right on her.
Ooh.
Killed her instantly. Horrible thing that happened. Totally random. I also had a tree fall on my house, but instead of falling on my house, it nicked my gutter, and my eaves were fine. There was nothing there were no big long lasting damages. Now, it was inconvenient. I lost power for a couple days, but I was fine. I was in the room. It's where the tree branch fell is right next to the room I record in.
Right.
And I was in this room when the tree branch fell.
Wow.
And I had lots of neighbors, lots of family say oh, wow, God really protected you. But God didn't protect the other lady.
Mm-hmm.
So the implication, I know that the meaning is not well, God murdered that other lady.
Yeah.
But that is the implication. I don't think you can say one without the other.
Yeah. Or at least, God didn't spare that person's life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sure that her family members, her kids, feel great about oh, I nicked by, I'm just fine. I only got a little bit of my gutters torn off.
And, and let me say this, because I remember last Thanksgiving, I can't remember. That was at the time when you were up with your parents because your father was recovering from his heart attack.
Yeah.
Okay. And but I ended up doing that short thing about gratitude. I'm not begrudging anybody for being grateful for the blessings in their lives. And if they want to thank God or Allah or whatever, whatever faith they are of, to be thankful for that. But just don't get so obsessed with like how wonderfully blessed you are that you turn a blind eye or you turn away from the people whose lives are not that way. I do not think that is consistent with the example of Jesus in the Gospels. And like, I have a series of magnets on you probably remember seeing these. I haven't changed them in years, but I have these magnets on this big filing drawers that I have in my office.
Oh,
metal.
Yeah, I do remember these.
One of them says, like Jesus would live in a gated community and tend a mega church.
Yes. Right. Yeah, that's where you're going to find him.
So I'm not begrudging gated communities or mega churches as long as that's not like a nice, safe, sequestered place away from the people. Say like,
but isn't that exactly what those are?
What?
Like, isn't that exactly what gated communities and mega churches are, though?
The gated community, let's say, I don't know if somebody has to live in a gated community. I understand like wanting some security. But
let me say it this way.
If somebody stays out of certain neighborhoods or refuses to go into certain neighborhoods, or they don't want to know what's going on in certain neighborhoods, then go ahead. You say what you were going to say.
Yeah. If Jesus was your pastor, would he build, would he spend $1 million on sound equipment? Is that what Jesus would do? Go back to the 90s. I mean, you said it's not bad to be grateful. I totally agree. Not bad to be grateful, but there is something about like being, so you put out that episode around Thanksgiving, grateful for the meal at the table. I think there are legitimate challenges to being grateful for your food, as if like God made it miraculously show up. Because Jesus wasn't out there like, oh, I'm just going to like miraculously produce food. He had fish and bread.
Right.
Or he went and worked in the fields on the Sabbath so that people could feed themselves.
Right. Right.
He's God. He can make grain, already threshed grain, appear.
Right.
Heck, just bring us the loaf.
Yeah, Jesus didn't snap his finger and all of a sudden they were all holding corn on the cob that was already cooked and buttered and salted.
Right. No, what he did was he said, no, disciples, you can go work in the fields on the Sabbath.
Right.
I'm going to break the law and let you go procure some food for us.
Yes.
That's different.
Absolutely.
That's a different type of gratitude as well.
Right. Right. There's let's put it this way. There's a gratitude in the sense of that includes appreciation, and and understands the value of the gift. And there's another type of gratitude that is kind of expressing a sense of entitlement.
Right. Yes, exactly.
And that may not be the best way to say it, but that's kind of what it seems to me like. And you have like, for example, the 10 lepers that Jesus heals and only one comes back to thank him. After he tells them, go to the priest so you can be declared clean. And they do, but only one made the trip back to thank him. And it's like there was so very little that he really would have hoped for was just them to walk back and say thank you. And
right. Well, and I think there's a political dimension to the correct type of gratitude for that sort of thing.
Right.
Because, let's go back to saying like, thank you for this meal. The correct type of gratitude, at least for me, is taking a moment to remind yourself that there's a supply chain that people really worked on, that human hands produced the food. and that sometimes those people aren't always in the best of situations, and that we rely on people that we don't know,
Yes.
that we are not self-sufficient, pull ourselves up by the bootstraps kind of people, and never have been.
Right. Yeah, I think that's another important aspect of gratitude is the interconnectedness of people. See, and that's another part of this narcissism. I understand that people want to be thankful to God for the things that they have, but how about being grateful to the people who actually contribute to our success? It may sound noble to want to act as though everything good that happens to us is like some part of God's big cosmic plan, as opposed to, hey, I want to thank my parents for raising me with the values they raised me with, teaching me how to work hard. And I want to thank my professors for being patient with me whenever I would argue with them in class or whatever it may be. It's just like I wish sometimes that I would have thanked my 12th grade English teacher, and I didn't. She passed away before I did, but she was the first teacher who gave me a B just because she knew I wasn't really trying hard.
Oh.
And this was 12th grade in high school, and I resented that at the time. And it wasn't until I was older that by the time I went to get my PhD, then I had a lot more appreciation for her, but she had passed away by then, Mrs. Sigler. And I went to her. I ended up getting A's for the semester and the final grade, which is what your GPA was calculated on whenever I went. But for that first quarter, I said, what was wrong with my essays and such that I wrote? She says, Kevin, I didn't give you a B because your writing's not worth an A. I just know that you're capable of so much more, and you're not even really trying hard.
Right.
And I went and complained to my parents, and now how dare she do that? Because I basically drifted my way through a lot of high school, and I didn't have to study in a lot of classes. They had a running joke. I'm not saying this to pat myself on the back, but there was a running joke in my father. In fact, within the last year, I guess at the barber shop that he goes to, ran into my old calculus teacher from high school. And he told my father, he said, he could have done anything he wanted to in life. He says, because basically I never took notes in the class, and I did all the homework, and I aced all the homework. I aced every test in calculus. I was gifted with math. And, so the teacher would, Mr. Winter, he would collect notebooks every quarter, and then you would get a notebook grade, and it would be a penalty if he was convinced that you weren't taking enough notes to help you do well.
Right.
Well, I never took any notes, so he never docked me any, but the students in the class convinced him on the final quarter, right before we graduated, to dock my grade like a half a point or something. So my average for the whole year wasn't 100%. It was like 99.99827.
That's so annoying.
Oh, I know. And so everybody else in the class just thought that was so funny. And anyway,
it is pretty funny.
It is. I mean, but Mrs. Sigler was the teacher who basically pushed me, and I really could not write. I mean, I wrote well, but I never cracked a book. And I think she believed that I was capable of doing much more. And she obviously did. And I never really challenged myself until I started to aim at going and get to Notre Dame. And then I really started working on my writing and everything. And so anyway, there are people like that. who are responsible. When I published my first book, my elementary school principal, her husband bought her a copy and sent it to me to
that's
sign.
nice.
And I sent it back to him, and he gave it to her for Christmas.
Aw.
Yeah, so it was so neat. She gave me a congratulations card and a gift when I got my PhD. And I actually have a letter from the children's author, Beverly Cleary. Have you ever heard of that lady? She wrote a lot of children's books.
The name rings a bell, but I couldn't name a book or anything.
Yeah, something in the Rats of Nim was one of her books. But Beverly Cleary was the author of children's books, and me and another student wrote her a letter saying about how much we enjoyed her book and that. And she actually responded to our letter, and the teacher kept it, who was the principal of the school, she kept the letter all those years. And I guess she figured that when I got my PhD that she didn't feel guilty, just go ahead and let me have the letter. So anyway, Laurie, if you're listening out there, I'm sorry. I've got the letter. I'll photocopy it for you if you want to copy. So anyway, Laurie Hall was Laurie Dermer. I sang it her in her husband's wedding. But this interconnectedness, see, the narcissism, I think is tied to things like not having sufficient gratitude. There's a big difference between this kind of narcissism and, say, like John Wesley seeing a drunk in the gutter and says, "There, but for the grace of God go I."
Right.
Okay. And Wesley did something to try to help those people too.
Right. Well, and it's not just a lack of gratitude, it's misplaced gratitude.
Oh, that's a good point. That's a good point.
It's this delusion that, like, oh, well, the supernatural world aligned to, make me important.
Yeah. It's, I don't know. And again, I really do think, and there's another aspect of this, and maybe this is another cause, but it also has obvious ramifications. I want to call, and this is something that we talked about maybe addressing, but this all seems to be more in line with what I would call a pre-scientific worldview. It's wanting to view the world as like this magical place, and everything that happens is a result of some kind of divine magic.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I definitely see where, I mean, I was going to draw a connection between like this and sort of like the Zodiac or
yeah, exactly.
What's the popular one with the
crystals,
the New Age crowd? Well, crystals, but also with the stars and everything. Come on,
astrology.
Yeah, astrology and like your sign and everything. That like the stars align and they manipulate your life. Like the stars care about you.
When the moon is in the 7th house, the dawning of the age of Aquarius. Anyway, go ahead.
It's sort of like a similar, pre-scientific interpretation of things.
Right.
And that will be a future episode.
Yes.
So that's a good teaser for what's coming down the pipes.
Well, and these do go hand in hand, because when people are so obsessed with their lives being kind of like a magical adventure, it's like this kind of narcissism. It's like they want their entire lives to be like a tour through Willy Wonka's chocolate factory. It's like, oh, what wonderful surprises around the corner next. I wonder what God has in store, and
well, but that's the environment that I think evangelical Christianity has created. Look at evangelical worship music.
Yes.
I mean, it's just rife in there. This like prosperity gospel, everything's about me. That's all worship music right now.
Well, it's just all a bunch of mindless emotionalism.
Yeah. Well, and even like the really like the ones that we really love as a culture, like "Great Are You, Lord." There's that line, "You restore every heart that is broken." Like God is just like there to fix your problems.
Yeah.
In No Longer Slaves, you have the line, "From my mother's womb, you have chosen me." These sorts of themes are just like everywhere in modern worship music. It's basically just like, it's manipulating you to feel like, oh, well, I'm desired by God, and so I desire God. And that's the whole message of it.
If I had $1 for every time I've heard somebody quote that Jeremiah text, I know the plans I have for you, I could have retired by now.
Yeah. Well, and taken so far out of context that, like,
yeah. I mean, you know, okay, this text is primarily about Jeremiah, secondarily about Israel. It's not about, okay, gee, there's another fetus. What do I plan for that person's going to be?
Well, and don't you know, Jeremiah's life was just like smooth sailing, super easy, very successful.
Yeah.
Israel didn't have any struggles.
Yeah.
After Jeremiah.
Well, yeah. Well, they didn't call Jeremiah. Oh, well, people don't want to think about that.
Right.
Like God's plans for him was to be the weeping prophet.
Yeah, he's called he's the happiest of the prophets.
Yeah.
Famously.
Mm-hmm.
Good.
He has a book. Yeah, it has a book of Lamentations. So
it's a self-help book. You should check it out.
Yeah, that's right. It's like power of positive thinking.
Right, exactly. That's what Jeremiah is all about.
So anyway, we get to this kind of, I just think people need to kind of keep their center and not lose sight of other folks, and we just got to break this like addiction to, always needing our egos stroked in some way. I know here's the thing. Sometimes there may be people that are dependent on this because they're actually not getting the kind of affirmation from other people that they should be getting.
Right.
I sometimes think that if people were more considerate and said thank you, or said, hey, that was really good what you did. I really appreciate that. And thanks for doing this. And, oh, you're a good person. I really appreciate you. I mean, if we did more of that, I don't think people would necessarily have to feel the need to somehow elevate every little detail of their lives to being some sort of cataclysmic event, you know?
Well, and isn't it also like sort of, I want to say that this God that has sort of taken over evangelical Christianity is the God of consumerist culture. Just if you get this, and this, then you'll be fulfilled. You'll be happy. If you have your desires fulfilled, if your dreams come true, then you can be happy. And which is so obviously a lie. But I think it's a misnomer to call the evangelical God the God of consumerist Christianity, but it is a partner to the God of consumerist America.
It really is. It's people aren't trying to understand God the way God is and then follow God that way, but it's more like they want to believe in God according to what they want God to be. And then even I think they're just shown a picture of God that isn't really based in anything other than, well, this is what culture tells us who God is. Like, God cares about you. God cares about everybody equally. And so he'll give you what you want if you are faithful to him. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like that, I feel like that is the dominant image of like the genie God, you know?
Yeah, it's kind of like, you know, the snake oil or something, you know, or the elixir that, you know, that the guy traveling the Old West, you know, in the old wagon is like, oh, this will cure everything you have.
This will cure all. Yeah.
And it's like, you just got to get up and sing and pray and read your Bible every day, and everything will just fall into place. And
right,
you know, you'll just have money poured out of your coffers and everything. And okay,
and so we've had the tie forward to what we're going to talk about with the pre and post scientific worldview.
Yes.
I want to tie us back into what we were talking about last week with the commons.
Okay. Right.
Because I think that Christianity, the Bible describes a Christianity that participates in a commons, right?
Right.
Is a communalist sort of structure to the church. I mean, if you look at Acts in two places, I know Acts isn't describing communism, but like, I'll just read it. Acts 2:44 through 45. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. In Acts 4, verse 32 through 35. Now the whole group of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and no one claimed private ownership of any possessions, but everything they owned was held in common. With great power the apostles gave their testimony to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was upon them all. There was not a needy person among them, for as many as owned lands or houses sold them and brought the proceeds of what was sold. They laid it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to each as any had need.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't see where the argument that that's not describing
Communism.
Or
Marxism anyway. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Marxism, I think that contains like the whole critique of capitalism, and that critique of like that very specific expression of Christianity is sort of baked into Marxism.
Mm-hmm.
But if we just like talk about communism, that's describing communism.
Well, a lot of people don't know this. When Marx's ideas started to become discussed in the late 1800s, like towards the turn of the 20th century, some of the Catholic popes actually said, this would actually be a good idea if we basically brought back the union of church and state again, and the church were running the show.
Running it, yeah.
Right. In other words, if we were given our place back at the table, along with the leaders of the countries, then we could maybe make something like this work. It wasn't until the communist revolution in Russia, when it ended up in a permanent dictatorship, that everybody started souring. And then, because even the word socialist before the Russian Revolution they used the word socialist interchangeably with communist. They would just call it socialism. Right. But then after they started trying to make a distinction between, government ownership versus government control and regulation. But there's still redistribution, but not through government ownership, but through government regulation. And that became known as socialism. And
well, at least here, I mean, if you actually read Marxists, they define communism as a stateless, moneyless, classless society.
Oh, right.
That's all. I mean, you can't, there is no state in communism. So there is no, socialism is the only form that has a state.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, and that's the thing. Marxism, it requires a revolution, and a revolution needs a leader. But then how do you find a leader who's going to give up power once the equilibrium is met?
Right. Yeah, that's the trouble.
Yeah. I guess you'd have to get some pointers from the Amish or something. So, because I think the Amish are probably as close. Well, there are probably some other cultures around the world that, like island nations and such,
don't have a proper pour.
Mauritius or whatever it is. There's a couple of places where they don't really have like a tribal chief or whatever. It's just kind of like a council of elders, just kind of shares power or something. I have to look back into that, but the Amish, they don't really want to have leadership, and so I've read these accounts where.
At least like political leadership.
Well, yeah. What even in the church?
I mean,
even in the church. Okay, so the Amish don't have like official ordination. So they just did I ever tell you about this? Did I ever talk about this? How they choose
I think we've talked about
with
it
the hymnals
bit,
and putting the verse of scripture in the hymnal.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, anyway. Yeah.
Well, no, I think it would be helpful to go over it again, though.
Okay, so I read this article by a reporter. She went and lived like in an Amish community and witnessed more than once, like the transfer of power, like after the leader, the elder who's leading the worship services and everything, or serving as the pastor. And their pastors aren't full time. So the pastoral duties you just take on over and above, like taking care of your farm and everything. Okay. Well, after like whenever a pastor passes away, then they have to select another pastor. Well, the way they did it in this Amish community that she was in, one of the elders who would basically be too old to take it went behind in another room behind a closed door and would listen while one by one the congregation would walk up and whisper a name to nominate somebody. Okay, one of the men. They would nominate one of the men. And then after all people whispered their nominations, the person behind the door kept a tally. And then the like 4 or 5 men who received the most nominations, okay, they would, they brought them out in front of the church, with each of them. There was a chair for them. And what they did was they had one hymnal for each of the men for the chairs. Okay. And they'd had a stack of hymnals that they would mix up. One of the hymnals had a verse, a Bible verse written on a little piece of paper and was slipped inside the hymnal. And then they would mix them up, and then they called those 5 men to the front of the church, and then one by one they would take one of the hymnals, and then they would all be instructed to look, and whoever ended up with the hymnal with the Bible verse in, then like, so it was partly they got a say in it, but then the final decision was God's, so to speak,
right,
by who got the hymnal. And she said that in both times when she saw this happening, like the man who got selected started weeping because he didn't want the responsibility, and they don't like being up front and having to lead and then have to take on all that extra work. And in one case, not only did the guy start crying, his wife started crying out in the congregation that her husband had been selected to be the pastor. And
well, that's understandable.
well, I was like, they must have attended some of the churches I've been to. Anyway, so, but yeah, but the Amish do have this kind of a more of a culture they've established where there's kind of this cooperation, and they have a system how to keep this, but
well, but they also don't have.
Yeah.
What they don't have is poverty.
Well, right.
Yeah. Like, I think that's another like important aspect of that. Like the Soviet state,
right?
They had poverty,
right?
Which now they didn't have. Like, to be fair to Russia, they didn't have homelessness. They did eradicate homelessness, but they did have poverty,
right?
So I think that those class distinctions are sort of like the antithesis of communism and what the Book of Acts is talking about, especially.
Right.
That like there would be rich and poor in the same church is unthinkable from the Acts perspective.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right.
That everybody would just be the same.
Well, and the Book of James talks about that too, about not showing preference to the rich. And then Paul saying about how everybody's equal in God's eyes and things like that. There was a lot of emphasis. I do tend to think, I think the evidence is there that early Christianity was very egalitarian. But see, this goes the opposite direction from this kind of narcissist
exactly.
Way of thinking. It's more about thinking about being a part of a community and how well the community is doing, not about how well I'm doing personally or what God's plan for me is, but it's more about the community and what's God doing in the group kind of a thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's what's missing in a lot of places, that communal emphasis, or let's say it could be emphasized a little more. People like bear one another's burdens, for example, quote another Bible verse. But nevertheless. So narcissistic Christianity, it's got a lot of number of causes. I mean, it's understandable to a point, but it just people get so carried away with it that it just starts leading to all this kind of indifference, apathy, irresponsibility. How else would you characterize the things we've been saying here? Anything we missed?
No, I think I would want to draw a stronger connection between like how the commons really does combat the narcissism.
Okay.
And I think part of it, I might use a dirty word here to some people, but that the commons and the picture of the church in Acts, and I think the picture of gratitude that Jesus portrays, and what we've kind of been talking about this whole time, is humanist.
Mm-hmm.
And that is like a dirty word for some people, the humanism.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it genuinely is that, and that Christianity properly understood is a humanist religion.
Yes. Yes. Okay. So boy, that might
Let me just open a can of worms right at the end.
That might be another preview into another episode, because here's the thing. I think that the way Christians refer to humanism is not really what humanism is. Like they'll say humanism, put yourself at the center of everything instead of God. But then they are basically ignoring that they're doing the same thing, but they're just crediting it to God. The humanists are at least saying, okay, this is what we think we ought to do. Like even accepting responsibility for your decisions can be interpreted as being humanist because you're not seeking the divine guidance of the Holy Spirit or something.
Right. So what I mean by that is that instead of, oh, God gave me all this wealth and stuff, God gave me good health, God saved me from this disease, and
right.
Having that sort of like narcissistic view of like, well, I'm special because God did this for me. The challenge of the commons is that like I am special in the context of a community that I belong to that takes care of each other.
Yeah.
Where we take care of each other. And my security in, where my safety comes from, where my belonging is, where my shelter and food is met, is in a community, not like it miraculously ended up on my plate somehow. That's the contrast that I want to be like very explicit that we're drawing here, because I think it's what we're saying is not intuitive.
Yeah. Well, and even the commons, the way we were discussing it before, and the way you were basically explaining the historic context of it, that's different. Like the book of Acts is like everything in common. So even a commons is just having a certain segment that's available for everybody equally. You might say, okay, there are a lot of churches where the entire church space, the facilities in that, everybody is equally using those, whether it's fellowship hall or the worship space or whatever. There are some exceptions. I remember a church I pastored had a small gymnasium, and then there was one of the board members that complained that the kids bouncing the balls off the wall were marking up the paint and stuff. It's like, okay, well, is it not for them to use? I mean, and then like people who complain because we tried to use the church men's softball team in the church league as a means of trying to get new young men into the church. And we just told them, hey, as long as you come to Sunday school twice a month, you can play on the team. And then some of the other people were like, we're here every week, we should be playing first, and they should be on the bench. And like they're missing the whole point of what it's about. And they're making it about them instead of about, others or what is in the best interest of the church or the kingdom of God or anything else. It's like, oh, I deserve to play first because I've been going to this church for so and so many years. And when you enter into it with that kind of an attitude, that's not really the right kind of attitude to start with. And so this kind of narcissism goes all the way to the opposite. It's really antithetical. to what you have like in the book of Acts, where everybody is in one accord and everybody sees their well-being tied up with everybody else's well-being.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That it is that, like, I am very intimately aware of the suffering of my brothers and sisters in this.
Yeah, we may have to have just like a, I don't know if we can do a full two-parter, but it would be good sometime to just even talk about humanism, like as a product of the Renaissance, and then like even like the Humanist Manifesto, and what was the philosophy behind that. What does it really stand for? I've heard that demonized. In fact, when I was a youth director, I used to demonize it myself, but that was before I really understood really what it was. I was going by what I
think there's a lot of misinformation out there. On humanism.
I can't put that on anybody else. This is before the internet, and I even read the Humanist Manifesto myself. But at that time, I had bought into this kind of mindset that, you're not supposed to put yourself first. You're supposed to like consult the Bible and pray about everything. And then, so the humanists say, no, we basically just try to meet the needs of people and promote values that everybody can embrace. And we embrace science and yada, yada, yada. But it might be interesting at some point to do something to kind of explain humanism, what it is, what it isn't, and like different forms it's taken, and maybe make some sense of that, because there still is some discussion about that. So, but yeah, the commons, the commons are definitely more of the direction that things ought to be headed, more back in that direction, in the sense that people need to start taking ownership in their neighbors, and their neighbors' well-being. And that is not only a Christian concept, that's a Judeo-Christian concept. And a lot of religions have something like this. And this kind of rugged individualism, or however you want to frame it, that does not really come from the world's great religions. That just comes from people that are self-serving.
Well, it comes from one of the world's great religions.
Just
capitalism.
Capitalism. Yeah, I thought that's what you were going to say. So
you know me so well.
I know. Yeah. We worship our God, Nelson Rockefeller, or whatever.
Yes.
Or J.P. Morgan. All right. Well. Anything else do we need to add here, or are we ready to wrap it up?
I'm good to wrap it up.
I think so too. So we've enjoyed discussing this with you. Hope you've enjoyed it too. We'd love to hear from you. Again, give us a review. Apple Podcast, Spotify.
Tell your friends.
YouTube. We've enjoyed our time here with you. Reach out to us at thehappycynics@gmail.com. We hope you have a great week. And if the world doesn't end before, we'll be back with another episode. And we hope you take care of yourself.